My name is Juan Montero. I'm part-time professor at the Florence School of Regulation, Transport Chapter. And with these sessions, I will be chairing all the sessions today. This is the first session opening the 9th conference on the regulation of infrastructures. The topic this year is sector coupling, how to regulate convergence. And the first paper that is going to be presented is presented by Fanny Vanrykel, PhD student at U St. Louis and Liège University in Belgium. Fanny was awarded with a Best Paper Award 2 years ago. And actually, it was one of the very first examples of analysis of across sectors. So it was electricity, transportation. So it was kind of one of the best, first and best examples also because it received an award. So it was not only the first, but best example of sector coupling. And so we are very happy to have her back again this year with another paper on sector coupling. So Ivana, you have around 8 minutes to make the presentation of your paper, and then I will pass the word to the discussants to make comments to your paper. So Fanny, if you want, the floor is yours.
So with the rise of environmental awareness, electric vehicles have laid at the cornerstone of EU policy for a low carbon transition and people mobility. And this paper concerns the electrification of road transport and more particularly how shifting from oil consumption to electricity consumption can affect road infrastructure financing. So this research departs from the starting point that oil and electricity are embedded into two different frameworks which frame these regulatory objects in different ways. So they can be both regarded as a source of revenue, as a commodity, as a source of environmental damage, and as a propellant for transport. It is important to note these understandings are not mutually exclusive and rather they coexist in law. The distinct features attributed to oil and electricity have shaped the actual content of this understanding in different ways, and these understandings have in turn shaped the content of legislative rules, leading to two different legislative stories. All of this implies the scale-up of electric vehicle, which is part of the electrification of transport, is likely to have sizable implications, notably as regards infrastructure financing. So my focus here is on the tax legislative framework, thus on tax law, but the analysis I make could be done in other areas of law. I studied the tax framework both at EU level and in Belgium as an example of national legislation because tax law is a matter of state sovereignty which requires unanimity. So I will start with oil and electricity as a source of revenue and as a commodity. I will not go into the details because you have read the paper and I don't have much time. So I can maybe go directly to the conclusion and the possible implications. So because we have two different frameworks and two different regulatory objects, one of the main differences is that there is an important difference in terms of tax rate. So basically, electricity is taxed at a much lesser rate or lower rate than oil. So this implies that with the electrification of transport, there could be a loss of revenue in reason of these differences in tax rate. The second implication regards the use of revenue. So where those revenues are earmarked, there is less flexibility to compensate the possible loss of revenue. Then as regards the distribution of revenue, so for instance in Belgium, excise duties is a matter on oil is a matter of federal jurisdiction, while both the federal authority and the regions tax electricity. So this means in the future, the revenue deriving from energy could be distributed differently among the state entities. And finally, there is currently a significant disparity of electricity tax rates between EU member states, which could create distortions. But in reason of the current battery capacity, I think that cross-border shopping of electricity is unlikely to occur, and the proportion of taxes in total electricity price is much lower than in the case of oil. So the possibility of distortion seems to me less important here. So the second understanding of energy is energy as a source of environmental damage. This has long been acknowledged in EU policy. So the main thing to remember here is that while there is no carbon tax at EU level, so there is an energy taxation directive with minimum rates, but this doesn't depend on CO2 emissions. So there is no carbon pricing directly at EU level as regard motor fuel, but in the case of electricity, there is the emission traded system, which covers large electricity installations. So basically, this implies that if member states at some point want to ensure electricity is produced from renewable energy, and if they consider the ETS is not sufficient because, for instance, of the high volatility of the system, then the interaction with the ETS needs to be considered. And the final understanding is the understanding of fuel for transport, so as a propellant for transport. And this relationship between oil and its use for transport purposes has long been acknowledged, and it was one of the objectives of transport policy. It was to internalize the external cost of transport, and this could be done via tax law, as well as there is a relation with infrastructure cost, which can be recoupled via tax law as well. While electricity has not been historically linked to transport, except like very small exceptions, so at least in tax law it was not the case. But there were some considerations, social consideration and economic concerns for low-income households, so which relates to energy affordability, and there were also some exceptions in tax law for industry, which are regarded as energy intensive to maintain their competitiveness. And so here the possible implication is that there could be a reduction of the extent to which infrastructure cost and external cost can be internalized because of the lower tax rate that I mentioned earlier. And so this could be particularly problematic in countries where such revenue are earmarked. And so for all these three reasons, so budgetary reasons in general, the objective to internalize transport externality more fully and to recouple infrastructure cost, member states could be willing to increase or change their energy taxation. But in such case, one could argue that a differentiation according to the purpose for which electricity is used can be necessary, especially based on the social and economic concerns I just mentioned. But the question here is whether it would be practically possible and how to do it. I have mentioned the interaction with the ETS as well. And to open the discussion a little bit further, one can consider whether road pricing would be an interesting solution to explore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will pass now the floor to the discussants. First discussion will be Susila de Almeida, FSR Energy. So Susila, the floor is yours.
So Fanny, thank you for sharing your paper. I'm happy when I have the chance of commenting a paper that I have seen your work before. So I still remember in 2018 when you were in UC Leuven discussing the interdisciplinary dialogue, law and economics between lawyers and economists. And I'm happy to see that that your work has been evolved. So for the audience, my name is Lucila de Almeida. I'm an energy advisor at Florence School of Regulation and assistant professor at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. So perhaps what I'm going to start as usually is to before actually jumping to my comments, actually give a bit of summary of how I understood your paper. Sometimes it's important to see how the reader read your argument rather than how they sometimes then the author explain its own argument. So your paper seems pretty clear in terms of the introduction and abstract. What precisely they want to do is the paper analyze the implication of energy taxation, at least the subject. Implication of energy taxation resulting from electrification of transport, and one thing that you emphasize in the title, especially in the future of infrastructure financing. So of course the subject is extremely topical and extremely important as far as you know, there is policies, there is a substantive amount of policies now driving for the electrification of the transport sector, and how could be the consequence for the revenue of the states based on the changes of taxations based on oil, and indeed definitely it's very topical. Good choice for the topic. Your assumptions about the understanding of tax law, it's an important information here. How tax law understands energy in different ways: energy as a source of revenue, energy as a source of environmental damages, and the tool of transportation. So your hypothesis, as I understood from your hypothesis, would be that distinct features attributed to oil and electricity have shaped the actual content of these understandings in different ways. And when it comes to the structure of the paper, the body of the paper in itself, I see that you put it you injected many informations in the body of the paper. So you speak about the harmonization in the energy tax, the energy tax directive, and you conclude that it's not well suited to purpose of environmental issues that of this, I would say this that has been discussed in recent years. No, then you come with the comparison of the minimal rates level tax of that is established in these directives at EU level. You speak about the multi-level competence of the tax, the EU, the national, and then you move to the transference of public revenues from federal to national to regional levels, how you compensate it. You move to carbon tax. At the end of the paper, like in the page 13, if I'm not wrong, you enter and you speak about energy and transport. And then you mention that the duty on motors fuels is located, that the tax is collected on oil fuels is allocated exactly to finance infrastructure. While in the electricity taxation is not only a matter of the rates that are lower, but as well how the state would allocate these revenues coming from tax. And then you come with the conclusion, as I read your paper, that the key conclusion that you wanted to have is to that here you would have perhaps you would have a problem of how to finance finance infrastructure with the movement of the electrification. So my feeling when I read your paper was exactly like this: a lot on the table, a lot on the plate. So give me a lot of information and make me a bit confused about what is this paper is really about? What's the problem you are looking, the question, what is the appropriate methodology, and convince me that your conclusion is right. So I will divide my comments into parts, basically about if I will give you some guidelines about how I see your paper and how you could have structured the paper, and the basis on complexity of tax law that I will leave to the end. So to speak about your paper precisely, this is where my feeling. You identify a problem quite well. You have a good question, but I don't see necessarily, you seem to have a good question, but I'm a bit lost throughout the paper to what extent you indeed have a very clear problem since the beginning, and to what extent your methodology is appropriate to your question. So I try to do some exercise, and here I'm trying to work with you this exercise. So I try to read your paper and say, okay, what is the paper is really about? So I create 4 options, option A, B, C, and D. Now let's go back. So is this paper about the harmonization issue precisely. I don't think it is, but let's suppose it is, as far as you take a long time explaining about it. So to what extent the ETD proposals are not well suited to current climate change force in transportation sector, no? So if this is your question, this is your purpose, as far as you take like around 10 pages only on this issue, what are the provisions? What could be the question? So what are the provisions of it, of an energy tax directive, which needs legal reform, and what could be appropriate methodology to convince what kind of changes? Would it be a paper, would they say, with policy recommendations, how to change the law, what are provisions that needs to be changed, and go throughout a very doctrinal reading of the ETD energy tax directive. So I don't think it is, but reading your paper, I might be confused that you could have gone in this direction. So the option B, I would say, you focus as well in the multi-level governance. Very important issues, different motors for, so you have a different allocation. Tax over electricity is competence of a federal or regional states, while the competence to tax electricity falls in another authority, another competence. This is a big issue, of course, and to make sure that actually municipalities and regional authorities would be converging to the same policy, it's quite hard. So you could have a question as well to make sure that the tax imposed by municipalities would converge with the same policies of electrification. So to what extent, what could be a methodology that would be appropriated for this? To understand a doctrinal research about what extent federal states could exercise control over municipality. These would be very legal questions, my option A, my option B. Go to option C and option D, which I think precisely it's what you wanted to do. And this is why the reason I said this. The loss of public revenues or the loss of public revenues for infrastructure. So I think your issue here that we want to answer is electrification of transport will reduce the state revenues coming from private transport, no? And which goes as well to the option B, which will be a second problem. Not only the loss of revenues, but as well the loss of revenue that would have a linked investment in infrastructure. To answer these questions here, if the problem is this, and if you wanted to build me a solution to say, okay, this is the problem, how I will solve it. My question to you is, to what extent, how is the methodology appropriated? So you wanted to answer me, what could be the solution? How I could have divided, how should I create new taxes? Should I increase the taxes, the minimum rate of tax that already existed? Should the government created a linked investment, which means like the tax is allocated directly to a certain public expenses? To do this, for my understanding, it's necessary to have some model of scenarios. So you have to create different scenarios with different ways of taxations to identify what could be the best model.
One minute, please. 1 minute.
1 minute. I'm finishing. I'm finished. I have just one point. So when I'm speaking about this, it goes back exactly to a discussion that we had in 2018. What is my concern? If you indeed want to go to the problem C, option C and option D, I don't know to what extent you would be able to what extent you can construct the methodology that would be appropriated, as far as you have to build in scenarios and economic modeling to come out and apply a methodology that would be indeed convincing me. You would have you bring value to the research you wanted to show me. This is exactly how I perceive. My second point is about complexities of law, and I will be very quick here as far as my time is ending. Just some just when you make the difference between energy as a source of revenue, energy as a source, I would be very cautious to be more analytical, distinguishing about the policies. Tax is a tool for public policies, and the tax is a source of revenue of public policies. Because regardless if the taxes is for environmental purpose or if the tax is to the distribution of wealth, this is always a public policy behind the taxes. Or environmental purpose. So, this distinction I didn't see as a 3 categories as you explain us. Is always as 2 categories. And about which tax are you speaking about? So, I think this is what you have a very good shot at table this table 1. but you didn't go deep, explain me every single text, every single height for what what is applied. So I see that I think one of the best, this table explains exactly about the degree of complexity, but I didn't see the degree of complexity being explained in your paper. So I will end my comments here, and thank you for your paper. I think it's there is potential, but needs to be working on it.
Okay, thank you, Lucila. We will pass to the second speaker, Matthias, please.
Then let me start with another point, that you know, maybe some engineering in the basis. I see a fundamental, I don't know, you have it somewhere in the paper, but the fundamental issue is that electricity is not an energy. Electricity is a vector. So that brings the question of double taxation. Electricity is produced from an energy source, and if it is produced from oil, then you tax oil, and then you tax it again when you have electricity. Of course, you have other sources that are taxed: coal, water, and so you know, I think that is, and you don't use that concept of double taxation, because somehow I think that could be also a problem that has to be highlighted. So I think to start on my slides, the topic is relevant. The topic is, I think, a little bit broader than I put here. There is a huge tax mess, as you have nicely on your table, and there are policy objectives, but it's not yet clear, and I'm with Lucila there, which is your policy objective. The objective is decarbonization, modal shift, but their policy objectives to raise revenues for the government. There is policy objective to get financing of infrastructure. So I think you have to look a little bit more, what is the policy objective, or can they all be combined? So I think the topic is relevant. The context, as you describe it, is appropriate. But then, you know, I really got stuck with the problem statement. What is really the problem that you're trying to address? Is it a big public policy problem of how to create modal shift if you have the different sources taxed differently or double taxed, as I would? Is it, and Lucila had that too, is it a question of harmonization? Is it a question of investment? But investment into what? Because basically the electricity infrastructure is already, there is no investment problem, because you have a weighted average cost of capital, and the transport is already paid for. So it's not the electricity that is basically the electricity that is consumed, that if it is taxed, that tax is not used for the infrastructure. What is used for the infrastructure is simply the transport, and that the WACC covers that. Is it a problem of investment into electricity generation? I don't think we see that problem. Or you know, or is it renewables? So my big question, I think you have an interesting topic, you have a good context, but what is it really you want to achieve with it? And then my last point, you have to properly conceptualize that the fact that electricity is not an energy, it's just a vector that transports energy, and there are even losses in there.
Thank you for your comment. So the first thing, which is a smaller point about electricity as a vector. So I think this is something I addressed, maybe not as clearly as what you said, but in the part regarding the understanding of energy as a source of environmental damage, I talk about the distinction between the fact that electricity is a secondary source of energy versus a primary source,
Yes.
which and the distinction between input and output. But I could emphasize more the I'd say the scientific distinction between electricity and oil. So this is the first thing, and the second thing. So maybe this should appear more clearly as well, but the objective of the paper was really to look, okay, if we shift from oil to electricity, we have different objects which in law have different functions. They've been, the tax law has different functions, and this is why there are different understandings as well. And so a regulatory function, a more budgetary function, and there is some link with transport, with environment, and so on. And so the objective was really to see, okay, now if we have electricity consumption, then there are probably some arguments to increase the tax rates of on electricity so as to recouple the loss of revenue or the internalization and so on. But then you can't just increase taxes on electricity. There are things you need to consider because they are different regulatory objects. So this was my main point, and I don't think I need to do like some modeling and so on. I just want to emphasize tax law or law understands energy, and then the implication about that.